Borders Britain drew to Nigeria. Imagine a land of rich rivers, dense forests and bustling markets. Hundreds of ethnic groups with their own kingdoms and empires lived here for centuries, until a distant empire arrived to redraw the map and change life forever. This is the story of how Britain carved Nigeria into a colony, shaping its borders, economy, and destiny. Before we dive into the main story, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell notification button for more interesting video like this. The beginning of British influence. Date: late 19th century, official control 1861 to 1914. First foothold: Lagos became a British protectorate in 1861. Motivation: trade, especially palm oil, and strategic control along the coast. At first, Britain was interested in commerce, but as rival European powers competed in Africa, control quickly expanded inland. The making of Nigeria. Colonial expansion. Britain gradually brought together northern and southern protectorates. 1914. The separate northern and southern protectorates were officially united to form Nigeria. Borders drawn. Artificial boundaries ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural differences, creating a patchwork of over 250 ethnic groups under one colony. Impact of British rule. Administration. Centralized bureaucracy, legal system, and indirect rule through local chiefs. Economy. Cash crops like cocoa, groundnuts, and palm oil became dominant. Resource extraction benefited Britain more than locals. Education and religion. Western-style schools and Christian missions spread, creating a new educated elite. Cultural effects. Traditional systems persisted but were sometimes undermined. Ethnic and regional divisions were accentuated by colonial policies. British rule laid the foundation for modern Nigeria's governance, but also seeded tensions that would shape politics for decades. Key historical moment. 1960, independence. After decades of nationalist movements led by figures like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo, Nigeria gained independence from Britain on October 1, 1960. Impact. A newly united nation began navigating its identity, development, and democracy under challenging post-colonial conditions. From Lagos to the northern protectorates, Nigeria's story shows how colonial borders, trade, and governance left a lasting imprint. But while Nigeria stepped into independence, the British Empire still stretched across Africa, the Caribbean, and Oceania. Next, we explore Ghana, the Gold Coast, where trade, wealth, and resistance tell another story of Britain's reach and Africa's resilience. The Gold Coast story, Ghana. Imagine a coast glistening with gold, bustling ports, and vibrant kingdoms trading with Europe for centuries. Then, a distant empire arrives, not just for trade but to dominate, reshape, and profit from every resource. This is the story of how Britain ruled the Gold Coast, and how its people would reclaim their freedom. The beginning of British influence. Date: early 19th century, 1821, formal colony status. First foothold: British forts along the coast, including Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle. Motivation: trade in gold, ivory, and, tragically, enslaved Africans. The Gold Coast had been a hub for European trade for centuries, but British dominance marked a new era, one where commerce became control, and forts became the centers of colonial administration. Expansion of British rule. Protectorates. By the late 19th century, Britain extended control inland through treaties with local chiefs. The Ashanti Empire, a powerful kingdom, resisted British expansion multiple times but was eventually defeated in 1900, marking the consolidation of British rule. Colonial economy. Cocoa became the main cash crop, transforming Ghana into a key supplier for the world. Railways, ports, and administrative centers were built to extract resources efficiently. Impact of British rule. Governance. Indirect rule. British officials governed through local chiefs, blending traditional structures with colonial administration. Centralized bureaucracy laid the groundwork for modern governance. Education. Mission schools introduced Western education, creating a literate elite. This elite would later lead nationalist movements. Cultural change. Christianity spread alongside traditional beliefs. Western law and infrastructure influenced cities and society. Economic transformation. Cocoa and trade brought wealth but made the economy dependent on Britain. Local artisans and industries often suffered due to colonial priorities. British rule shaped Ghana's borders, economy, and political system, but the people's identity, culture, and resistance never disappeared. Key historical moment. 1947, a rise of nationalism. Kwame Nkrumah founded the United Gold Coast Convention (UGCC), demanding self-rule. 1957, independence. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from colonial rule. Impact: Ghana's independence inspired liberation movements across Africa, signaling the beginning of the end for the British Empire on the continent. From bustling coastal forts to cocoa plantations, Ghana's story shows both the influence and the limits of British power. The Gold Coast taught the world a lesson: even under empire, the spirit of the people cannot be colonized. But while Ghana celebrated independence, other parts of the British Empire, from Kenya to South Africa, Australia, and the Caribbean, continued to feel the heavy hand of rule, and their stories are waiting to be told. Series takeaway for this African chapter: British colonization shaped politics, economy, and infrastructure in Nigeria and Ghana. Artificial borders and indirect rule created challenges and legacies that remain today. Resistance and nationalism proved that colonial power was not absolute. Africa's story under Britain was not only about control, but also resilience, culture, and independence. Land taken, voices rise, Kenya. Picture rolling savannas, fertile highlands, and thriving communities. Now imagine a distant empire arriving, claiming the best lands, building railways through people's homes, and reshaping society forever. This is the story of Kenya under British rule, a story of exploitation, resistance, and eventual liberation. The beginning of British influence. Date: late 19th century, 1895, official British East Africa Protectorate. Motivation: strategic control of East Africa, access to the Indian Ocean, and resource exploitation. Key players: British officials, settlers, and the Imperial British East Africa Company initially managing administration. At first, Britain's goal was trade and control of key ports, but the fertile highlands of the Kikuyu, Maasai, and other communities soon became coveted by settlers. Colonial expansion and oppression. Railway construction 1896 to 1901. The Uganda Railway was built to connect the coast to Lake Victoria. Thousands of local laborers, often under harsh and dangerous conditions, were forced to work. Land seizure. White settlers took the White Highlands, displacing local communities. Indigenous people were confined to reserves, disrupting agriculture and livelihoods. Indirect rule. British authorities governed through local chiefs but heavily favored settlers' interests. Kenya's fertile lands and labor became a source of wealth for Britain, but at a huge cost to the local population. Resistance and nationalism. 1920s, 1950s. Local communities resisted through protests, petitions, and small uprisings. Mau Mau Uprising, 1952 to 1960. Armed rebellion by the Kikuyu and other communities against colonial rule. Brutal suppression by the British, including detention camps and forced labor. Legacy: Mau Mau fighters became symbols of resistance and national pride. Impact of British rule. Economic transformation: cash crops, tea, coffee, sisal, produced for export. Infrastructure: railways, roads, and ports shaped modern Kenya. Education and religion: missionary schools spread Western education and Christianity. Cultural and social effects: land dispossession and forced labor disrupted traditional societies. Ethnic divisions were reinforced by colonial policies. British rule left both development and deep scars. The struggle for justice and self-determination would define Kenya for decades. Key historical moment. 1963, independence. Kenya became independent on December 12, 1963, under Jomo Kenyatta, the first president. Impact: the nation began reclaiming its land, identity, and voice, while building a democratic government. From the railways of the Uganda Railway to the resistance of the Mau Mau, Kenya's story is one of courage in the face of empire. But while independence came at last, the British Empire still stretched across southern Africa, Australia, and the Caribbean, each holding its own stories of struggle, survival, and transformation. Next, we turn south to South Africa, where riches, racial policies, and resistance would leave a complex and enduring legacy. Empire and division, South Africa. Imagine a land of breathtaking coastlines, vast plains, and mountains rich with minerals. But beneath its beauty lies a history of conquest, exploitation, and division. This is South Africa, a land transformed by empire, conflict, and resilience. The beginning of British influence. Date: 1806. Britain seizes the Cape Colony from the Dutch, Boers. Motivation: strategic control of the Cape for trade routes to India and dominance over southern Africa. Key players: British colonial authorities, Dutch settlers, Boers, and indigenous groups such as the Xhosa. Britain's arrival intensified competition over land, labor, and political control, setting the stage for centuries of conflict. Colonial expansion and conflict. Anglo-Boer Wars, 1880 to 1881 and 1899 to 1902. Fought between British forces and the descendants of Dutch settlers, Boers, over control of the gold and diamond-rich territories. The Second Boer War devastated Boer civilians, with British concentration camps causing thousands of deaths. Land and labor policies. Indigenous Africans were pushed off fertile land and confined to reserves. Labor was exploited in mines, farms, and infrastructure projects. Economic transformation. Mining boom, discovery of diamonds 1867, and gold 1886, made South Africa a global economic hub. Infrastructure. Railways, ports, and towns were developed to transport minerals and goods. Impact on society. Economy benefited British settlers and corporations far more than local populations. Segregation policies institutionalized inequality, laying groundwork for apartheid. Cultural and social impact. Education and religion. Western education and Christian missions were introduced, mostly for settler or elite African communities. Ethnic and racial divisions. Policies reinforced racial hierarchies between whites, Africans, and other groups. Resistance. Indigenous communities resisted through rebellions and later political movements. Key historical moment. 1910 Union of South Africa. The British colonies and Boer republics united under a dominion of the British Empire. Impact. South Africa remained under British influence, but white minority rule marginalized the majority African population. 1948 and beyond, apartheid foundations. Though technically after direct colonial rule, British policies and segregation practices set the stage for apartheid. Resistance movements grew, culminating in leaders like Nelson Mandela and the eventual dismantling of apartheid decades later. From the gold mines of Johannesburg to the battlefields of the Boer Wars, South Africa's story under Britain is one of wealth, exploitation, and deeply entrenched divisions. But while the British Empire's power waned here, far-off lands like Australia, New Zealand, and the Caribbean still bore the imprint of empire, each with their own stories of challenge, survival, and eventual self-determination. Next, we sail to the Southern Hemisphere, where convicts, settlers, and treaties shaped Australia and New Zealand in the Age of Empire. The First Fleet, Australia. Imagine a vast, untamed land across the ocean, harsh deserts, dense forests, and rich coastlines. Britain saw not a wilderness but an opportunity, a place to send its prisoners, grow its influence, and stake a claim in the Pacific. This is the story of Australia under British rule, where settlement began with chains and evolved into a nation. The beginning of British settlement. Date: 1788. Event: arrival of the First Fleet at Botany Bay, led by Captain Arthur Phillip. Purpose: establish a penal colony for Britain's overcrowded prisons. Ships: 11 ships carrying convicts, soldiers, and settlers. The First Fleet marked the start of permanent European settlement, introducing British governance, culture, and law to a land already inhabited by indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years. Expansion and colonization. Settlement growth. Sydney became the first major settlement. Additional colonies like New South Wales, Tasmania, and Victoria soon followed. Economic development. Agriculture, wool, and later mining became central to the colonial economy. Convict labor and free settlers provided the workforce. Indigenous displacement. British expansion led to the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples from their lands. Disease, frontier conflicts, and cultural disruption caused severe population decline and social upheaval. Impact of British rule. Governance. British legal and administrative systems were established. Local colonial governments developed, eventually moving toward self-rule. Culture and language. English became the dominant language. British customs, education, and Christianity shaped society. Infrastructure. Railways, ports, and cities developed to support settlements and trade. Resistance and survival. Aboriginal communities resisted where possible, preserving culture and traditions despite colonial pressures. Key historical moment. 1901, Federation of Australia. Former colonies united under the Commonwealth of Australia. Self-governing but still part of the British Empire. Impact. Laid the foundation for modern Australia's democracy and national identity. From convicts on the First Fleet to the booming cities and fertile farms, Australia's story is one of endurance, adaptation, and slow nation-building. Yet, across the oceans, New Zealand awaited colonization, treaties, and cultural clash, while the Caribbean and Africa continued to feel the enduring reach of the British Empire. Next, we journey to New Zealand, where the Treaty of Waitangi would change history and shape the future of the Maori people and the settlers alike. A treaty that changed all in New Zealand. Imagine a land of dramatic fjords, rolling hills, and thriving Maori communities, rich with culture and tradition. Then imagine foreign ships arriving, bringing settlers and a distant crown, promising protection and trade, but also claiming control. This is the story of New Zealand under British rule, where diplomacy and conflict intertwined to shape a nation. The beginning of British involvement. Date: 1769. Captain James Cook charts New Zealand's coast for Britain. Early British interests: trade, whaling, and later missionary activity. Indigenous peoples. The Maori, organized into tribes iwi, with rich social structures, initially engaged in trade with Europeans. Early encounters were a mix of curiosity, commerce, and cultural exchange, but the seeds of conflict were already being sown. The Treaty of Waitangi. Date: February 6, 1840. Event: signing of the Treaty of Waitangi between British representatives and Maori chiefs. Purpose: establish British sovereignty while guaranteeing Maori rights to their land and resources. Challenge: different interpretations in Maori and English versions of the treaty led to disputes over land, authority, and governance. Colonial expansion. Settler growth. British settlers arrived in increasing numbers, forming towns and farming communities. Land conflicts. Disputes over ownership led to New Zealand Wars, 1845 to 1872. Economic development. Sheep farming, gold mining, and trade expanded under British control. Impact on Maori. Loss of land, resources, and autonomy. Resistance through warfare, negotiation, and cultural preservation. Impact of British rule. Governance. British-style parliamentary systems established, creating the foundation for modern democracy. Language and culture. English became dominant, but Maori language and traditions survived and remain vital. Infrastructure. Roads, ports, and towns were built to connect settlements and support trade. Education. Missionary and government schools introduced Western education. British influence reshaped the land, its economy, and governance, but Maori resilience ensured their culture endured despite colonization. Key historical moment. 1907, Dominion status. New Zealand became a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. Impact. Marked the transition from colony to nationhood, while retaining ties to Britain. Cultural legacy. Ongoing debates and settlements over Maori land and treaty rights continue to shape New Zealand today. From the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi to the establishment of a self-governing dominion, New Zealand's story is one of diplomacy, conflict, and resilience. The British Empire may have planted its flag here, but the people shaped their land, culture, and identity in ways no empire could fully control. Next, we turn to the Caribbean, where sugar, trade, and slavery created wealth for Britain and hardship for millions. Another story of power, resistance, and survival under empire. Sugar, chains, and empire, the Caribbean. Imagine a tropical paradise, sparkling beaches, fertile lands, and thriving communities. Now imagine it transformed by distant powers, where wealth for some was built on the suffering of many. This is the story of the British Caribbean, a story of sugar, slavery, and the indomitable spirit of its people. The beginning of British colonization. Date: 1655, Britain seizes Jamaica from Spain. Motivation: strategic control of trade routes and lucrative sugar plantations. Expansion: other islands like Barbados, Antigua, and the Bahamas were already British-controlled or became colonies soon after. The Caribbean became a central part of Britain's global empire, supplying sugar, rum, and other goods to fuel trade and wealth across Europe. Plantation economy and slavery. Labor system. African slaves were forcibly brought to work on sugar plantations, forming the backbone of the colonial economy. Living conditions. Harsh labor, brutal punishment, and little freedom made life extremely difficult for enslaved people. Economic importance. Caribbean sugar fueled European markets and enriched British merchants and settlers. Resistance and rebellion. Maroon communities. Escaped slaves formed independent communities in Jamaica and other islands, resisting colonial control. Slave rebellions. Numerous uprisings including the Takis War 1760, in Jamaica challenged British rule. Abolition. 1833, slavery abolished in the British Empire. Freed Africans and their descendants continued to fight for land, rights, and equality. Impact of British rule. Culture. English language, Christianity, and British law became dominant, blending with African traditions. Economy. Cash crops and trade networks shaped local economies long after slavery ended. Social change. Colonization left legacies of inequality, but also resilience, cultural fusion and rich traditions, music, food, festivals. National identity. The Caribbean people forged strong cultural identities despite centuries of exploitation. The Caribbean shows how people endured the most extreme conditions, resisted oppression, and preserved their culture under colonial rule. Key historical moment. 1962 Jamaica gains independence. First island in the English-speaking Caribbean to gain independence. Impact. Sparked nationalist movements across the region from Trinidad and Tobago to Barbados and beyond. Cultural legacy. Caribbean culture, music, language and traditions became a powerful symbol of identity and resistance worldwide. From sugar plantations to Maroon rebellions, the Caribbean story shows the brutal power of empire and the incredible resilience of its people. While Britain may have ruled the seas and lands, the spirit of the people endured, reshaping history on their own terms. The British Empire had now touched every continent: North America, Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Caribbean. Its reach was vast, its influence deep, but the stories of resistance, survival, and nation-building prove one thing: no empire, however powerful, can erase the spirit of its people. Series summary takeaways. Britain's global colonization spanned centuries and continents. Colonies were shaped by trade, conflict, governance, and culture, often leaving mixed legacies. Across continents, people resisted, adapted, and eventually reclaimed freedom, identity, and nationhood. The story of the British Empire is not just about conquest. It's about the lasting resilience of humanity. Want more stories like this? Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our story, because this is just getting started.